I am Cinnamon Dornseif, and I'm the director of the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute. SAIS houses a number of research centers and institutes that complement the school's academic programs, and the Foreign Policy Institute is the oldest among these. So it was established originally in 1957 and then was renamed in 1980 as the Foreign Policy Institute, established by one of our former deans. And it has served its mission since that time of uniting scholarship and policy at SAIS through its mission of special programming that develops realistic answers to the international challenges facing the United States and the world. And so our event today is launching this new publication, Crisis, Stability in Space, China and Other Challenges. And it is a very timely update to an earlier report on this very same topic that was published in 2016. And I'd like to give my thanks and appreciation to my former executive director of the Foreign Policy Institute and now a senior fellow, Carla Freeman, and also special thanks to our senior research assistant, Jacob Barlow, for all of his hard work in dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's. It's just really quite amazing. I'd also like to thank all of the very hardworking staff of the Foreign Policy Institute and indeed of our SAIS events team and of the Dean's office in making sure that this event was possible. I'm going to give the background on one of our lead authors, Bruce MacDonald, who is associated with us here at the School of Advanced International Studies. And he is going to be leading off our discussions, and he will also be so kind as to introduce our other speakers in the order in which they will be presenting, and just give you their backgrounds and bios. But let me give you a background on Bruce. So he has taught and lectured here at SAIS on nuclear non-proliferation, and he consults on nuclear military space and cybersecurity policy issues. He's the editor and co-author of the 2016 report that I just mentioned, Crisis, Stability in Space, China and Other Challenges, and he was the senior director of the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States, the commission led by former Defense Secretaries William Perry and James Schlesinger. He's participated in numerous Track 1.5 and Track 2 dialogues with China, the Russian and other counterparts, and supported advanced technological programs with a number of institutions around Washington. He's worked on ballistic missile defense and other strategic nuclear issues in the Clinton White House and as senior director for science and technology at the National Security Council staff and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. He was a professional staff member of the House Armed Services Committee, responsible for oversight on military space, Air Force, ballistic missile defense, and strategic force acquisition budgets. At the State Department, he analyzed strategic forces, ballistic missile defense, and arms control, serving on the U.S. START delegation in Geneva. He is a graduate of Princeton University and has a really interesting background for this work with a MSE and a BSE in aerospace engineering, and also as an MPA from Princeton University in those related topics. It is my great pleasure to, before turning this over to Bruce, to make a very exciting announcement. So space is in the air today, and I am delighted to share that today, Johns Hopkins University and our Dean's Office announced a new partnership with the U.S. Space Force for graduate education specifically to prepare U.S. Space Force personnel for the evolving needs of this newest branch of the United States military. So it is really quite an honor for SAIS to have been selected for this partnership, and I'm just delighted that today is the day that we are having this discussion with so many experts and colleagues who are going to discuss this incredibly interesting and important topic. So Bruce, I turn the floor over to you, and welcome everybody again to this very important event launch for this very important new publication.
Okay, well, Cinnamon, thank you very much. and a warm welcome to you all. It's good to have you here to talk about an issue that has been just growing by leaps and bounds. Space seemed almost like a backwater maybe a decade or two ago, and suddenly it is all over the news. It's been, as Cinnamon has mentioned, it's been 6 years since this report first came out in its earlier version, and it's been an unbelievably change-worthy, or characterized by a high degree of change, unprecedented change in the space domain since it first came out. Information remains the lifeblood of U.S. military forces, and our panelists here, we are going to discuss how the impact of this is experienced in our military posture and in our policy. I want to introduce our panelists. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Brian Weeden with us. We have a distinguished panel with really substantial background in the space field, and both in technology and in policy. Brian is the Director of Program Planning at the Secure World Foundation, a wonderful organization, nonprofit, and has nearly 2 decades of professional experience in space operations and policy. He directs strategic planning for the foundation and future year projects to meet their goals and objectives, and conducts research on space debris, global space situational awareness, space traffic management, protection of space assets, and space governance. Issues that, if you haven't heard about them before, you're going to be hearing a lot more about them, not just today, but in the months and years ahead. He's held any number of positions in international fora and organizations. Most recently, he has been the executive director of the Consortium for Execution of Rendezvous and Servicing Operations, real space Star Wars kind of stuff, known as CONFERS. And in the industry, it's rapidly gaining a reputation as being the authoritative spokesperson for industry. And just as a side note, I'd add one of the big changes that's happened in the space field has been, in years past, it's been all about government activities. Well, suddenly, in just the last few years, as we'll talk about in a moment, the civil side, the commercial side of space has taken a profound role, played a profound role, and had a huge impact. It's been like a huge shot of adrenaline into the space field. With all due respect to government, sometimes government reminds me of, there's an old B.B. King blues song called Built for Comfort, Not for Speed. And I've often thought that sometimes characterizes the government, particularly when it comes to space. But prior to joining the Secure World Foundation, Brian served 9 years active duty as an officer in the Air Force, working on space and intercontinental ballistic missile operations, i.e. he was one of those guys down in the hole who, if the message signal ever came, he would push the button. He was part of the U.S. Strategic Command's Joint Space Operations Center. He directed the Orbital Analyst Training Program. His research and analysis has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, USA Today, and I could go on and on. He's got a BSc in electrical engineering from Clarkson University, a Master of Science in Space Studies from the University of North Dakota. He's also a graduate of the International Space University Space Studies program in Beijing, no less. And he has a PhD in public policy and public administration from GW in the field of science and technology. Going on, we have honored to have Karl Mueller with us. And to show you what a dedicated guy he is, we were hoping to have Audrey Schaffer here from the National Security Council staff, And we got a warning yesterday and a confirmation this morning that her bad cold that she had gotten even worse today, and she didn't want to inflict on everybody here, much less not be able to carry out her duty. She's a very responsible person, so she had to back out. And of course, when you're trying to organize an event, the last thing you want is to have an important speaker back out. But fortunately for us, we had not only get somebody who was going to come anyway, not only get somebody who's a co-author of our publication, but a guy who said, "Yeah, okay, I'll come." A brave man indeed. Karl Mueller, sitting immediately to my right. He's a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, and he's a specialist in research related to military and national security strategy, particularly coercion, deterrence, and escalation. Well, you couldn't ask for much better than that for a pinch hitter. He's written and lectured on a wide variety of subjects, including air power theory, grand strategy, economic sanctions, nuclear weapons, Baltic and Nordic defense issues, space deterrence, and wargaming. He has a number of unclassified RAND publications and undoubtedly a substantial number of classified publications. And in fact, his current research projects focus on the use of air power in the Russia-Ukraine war. Gee, I wonder if there's any relevance to what's going on today there. And strategic competition with Russia and China, and just any number of topics. He also was a professor of comparative military studies at the U.S. Air Force's School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, and he's a faculty member at the Pardee Rand Graduate School and an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. How about that? And he earned his PhD in politics from Princeton University. And then finally, and last but not least by any means, Kari Bingen. Kari was a pleasure to work with when I worked with her on the Strategic Posture Review Commission. Kari's the director of the Aerospace Security Project and a senior fellow at the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a neighbor of ours here at SAIS. And her research interests include national security, space, intelligence, and emerging technology issues across the public and private sectors. She joined CSIS just recently from Hawkeye 360, an innovative space technology company creating a new class of radio frequency data and analytics, where she was the chief strategy officer. Prior to that, she served as the U.S. Senate confirmed Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, overseeing the defense intelligence and security enterprises. You may not have heard much about this, but imagine this is this not well-known enterprise comprising more than 120,000 personnel and an annual budget of over $54 billion. So you may not have heard of it, but they have a big impact. And she had a very responsible role there. And she's worked with the U.S. Defense and Intelligence Community clients as a space systems analyst at SRA International, and then as a senior space policy analyst at the Aerospace Corporation, not far away, just across the river. She is, in whatever spare time she has left, she's an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University and a member of the Common Adjunct Assistant Professor. She's of the Common Mission Project Advisory Board, and she's a member of the U.S. Strategic Command Strategic Advisory Group, and she's a graduate of this university. You may have heard of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, so she knows a thing or two about technology, I'm pleased to announce, with a degree in aeronautics and astronautics, and she was a 2002 NRO Technology Fellow. So quite a distinguished panel we have, and we feel fortunate to have them. So that's our group. And I guess what I will do then is I will lead off with a brief overview. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of this publication, and we can go from there. If it's all right, I will speak from the table here. One of the things that really strikes me the most in space and the changes that have happened in space is as much of the rest of modern life, information remains key. It's the central focus, and that information is the lifeblood of U.S. military forces. By the way, okay, good. Satellite information enables our weaponry to be far more effective, and it enables much better U.S. tactical and strategic decision-making. And people sort of wondered back in the Gulf War, showing part of my age, back in the early 90s, people were used to the idea of bombers flying over targets and dropping what they affectionately call dumb bombs on targets. And suddenly people saw missiles with bombs in them going through individual windows of buildings to hit their targets. This is all made possible because of information coming largely from space satellites. So much so that China was very observant of what took place during the Gulf War, and they realized suddenly that they had a whole lot of catching up to do. And they talk about the need to be able to fight informationized wars where information played a dominant role. Plus, there's the whole question about communication, which is essential to keep decision makers in touch with U.S. forces around the world. I mean, wars in the dim past might have been fought a lot differently if leaders had the information that leaders today have almost at their fingertips. So information dominates the planning for conflict. If the U.S. suffered a serious loss of space asset effectiveness, it would turn our military, I love the retired general friend of mine, said it would turn our military in a flash from an information age fighting force to an industrial age fighting force having much less capability. This potential Achilles heel of space makes the U.S. space assets a priority target for China, and in a crisis there would be great incentives for an adversary, be it China or anybody, to strike first in space rather than to absorb a blow and do a retaliation. As my friend Karl Mueller here reminds us, in his chapter in both the first volume and this volume, says that events in space do not happen in a vacuum. Really, if everything is peaceful on Earth, but a war breaks out in space, it's not likely to continue for very long. But that if space is quiet, but there's heavy conflict going on, it's only a matter of time before the space domain would get sucked into the struggle. Jacob? So China's space challenge and its implications, U.S. space architecture certainly has vulnerabilities of which China is well aware. If your choice is to strike first in space with intact forces or strike second with surviving forces, if conflict seems inevitable, you'd almost certainly want to strike first, especially if the conflict seems inevitable and the escalation risks are high. Now, jamming has been part of conflict for years, and the temptation would be to escalate gradually if you don't intend an all-out space war. But this has risks. Offensive space weapons are not surgical tools. There can be great uncertainty about weapons effects. If you drop a bomb, you kind of know what it will do and what it won't do to accomplish. But space weapons, because systems are so highly interconnected, you don't know how great the impact might be. I've been in war games where you've seen where an attack has a tremendous impact on the military capability of the other side, but it may be a lot more impact than the attacker intended. But the person who's attacked isn't going to think, oh, that was probably a mistake. He didn't really mean to do that much destruction. No, you're going to think, hey, look what those guys did. We can't take that sitting down. We got to hit back. So the possibility for miscalculation and misestimation is, not to mention Murphy's Law and Mother Nature. I say these are some of the big things. I mean, no, people know what it's like to suffer from Murphy's Law, but they don't know when the other guy is doing it, if it was Murphy's Law taking place, or whether they really intended to do all that damage. So it's a very unstable situation. And so in space, a disabling first strike is preferable to and easier to execute than absorbing that first strike and then retaliating. After all, if you strike first, you know when you're going to strike, so you can be all set, and it's easier. You have a full force posture. You don't have damaged assets. So this is the essence of crisis instability, when preempting pays far greater benefits than retaliating. This is a fundamental issue in the space domain. Other fundamental issues are uncertainty and risk aversion. Any attacker is going to do worst case analysis, unless they happen to be Vladimir Putin, maybe, in Ukraine, where he thought he knew what was going to happen. The attacker is always going to worry that his attack might be less successful than planned, while the victim's retaliation might be more successful than planned. And there's so much technological change taking place that it's becoming increasingly difficult to estimate what the damage is going to be. Now, there may be a bit of deterrence possible from that, because if the other guy you think could possibly be more effective than what you do, that could deter you from wanting to start an attack in the first place. And then, as if that's not enough, you've got the problem of the size and the present and future capabilities of adversary space offense are not well understood, and both sides keep it hidden, unlike nuclear weapons. We know very well what the Chinese have in nuclear weapons, and they know what we have. But space weapons, space offense, is kept hidden. We'll talk about that in a moment. Another problem is that space conflict is really a brand new field, and there's not a lot of experience. If you put up an ad looking for someone with 20 years experience in space conflict, any takers you get to your ad are going to be liars. So there's no experience there. And there's what I call the sorcerer's apprentice problem. You may remember from the old story about the sorcerer who goes away, and his apprentice grabs his magic wand and thinks that he can be powerful like the sorcerer, and only he's not familiar with how it works, and he creates chaos. The same way you could have a sorcerer's apprentice problem here, where inexperienced leaders, at least inexperienced in space conflict, create all kinds of problems. So you want what's the answer to this problem? In a way, it's to have survivable forces, but that's hard to do. The survivability is quite difficult, and that's why we have been devoting a lot of attention to that recently, and looking to how to develop resilient space architectures that are more capable of surviving. We are fortunate as the United States that we have a huge or a substantial alliance structure with allies and partners, which is a big asset to us. Mixing military and commercial U.S. and friendly foreign payloads strengthens space deterrence. And that way, other countries have a greater stake in space stability, raising the price for adversaries to initiate space attacks. There's been a concern over the years that maybe countries wouldn't want to do this, but so far they have not shied away from being active participants. So for a change, extended deterrence, i.e. where the United States spreads its nuclear umbrella over other people, there's more of a two-way street here where we get maybe as much benefit from our allies as they do for being allied with us, as they do, as we do for having them being allied with them. It's a major unappreciated advantage for the United States over China and Russia. We're fortunate to have Brian Weeden here, who in a moment is going to talk about space sustainability, but just a few interesting facts. 10 years ago, only 10 years ago, there were about 1,100 active satellites in orbit. Today there are, and this is an exact figure from as of June, 6,035 active satellites. And over half of them belong to Elon Musk. If nothing says what has changed in the commercial world more than that figure. And as if that's not enough, the Government Accountability Office projects that there will be an extra, are you ready for this, 58,000 satellites in orbit by 2030. That's just 8 years from now. This shows the dynamic nature of space technology and the vigor of the free market, and also the strong need to look at the implications of such growth for space stability and how to ensure that the space traffic management issues those numbers imply can be managed and anomalies in a crisis safely addressed. And as if that's not enough, a rough calculation suggests the number of satellites could exceed 500,000 satellites in orbit. That's 500 times more than there were 10 years ago, that based on just announced plans. At a minimum, this would seem that the satellite collisions are likely to increase, and their occurrence during a crisis could be terribly destabilizing. We have a need for greater dialogue and diplomacy with potential adversaries, but that's not going to be enough. Not enough attention was paid in the past to dialogue and diplomacy to enhance stability in space. Unfortunately, the United States has been more active in trying to take up a dialogue with the Chinese than China has been. They have not reciprocated our interest. The U.S. needs to call out China on this unwillingness to discuss these issues. That not only would talks be useful in and of themselves, but it would help establish lines of communication between our governments that could be vital in a crisis. And signaling in a crisis is likely to be more productive than sending signals of either potential escalation or wanting to promote peace. They'd be more productive if they're preceded by ongoing dialogue and interaction, where you have some kind of a relationship with your counterparts. And then, as if that's not a problem enough, there's what I call, and I'm not the only one who calls it this, the Hyten conundrum. John Hyten was the deputy chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the head of Strategic Command. He was a big believer in the potential of space military capabilities. But he raised the question, how do you deter if your adversary doesn't know what your offensive capabilities are? Unlike with nuclear weapons, where we know what the Russians have and what the Chinese have and they know what we have, what do we do about space offense? Should we stay quiet? Should we drop hints about what we have or be more revealing? Maybe we could couple it. The one piece of advice I would give on this issue is whatever you decide to do, there's an important lesson to be learned from both Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter in their presidencies, which is if you're going to make a big offensive Amendment, people being the way they are, they want some hope that you're not consigned to to just having nothing but weapons and no possibility for peace. So maybe we could do something like, and just throwing it out for consideration, have the United States to consider a suggestion for a no first use policy for space offense. If we're more dependent on space than anybody else, wouldn't it make sense to at least think about the possibility of having saying a pledge that we would not be the first to use offensive space weapons? I think that could be useful, but I'd want to evaluate it first. We want to have one big change that's happened is what's the phenomenon known as resilience. That satellites that we have, are not these big, expensive, vulnerable satellites that are what General Hyten referred to as big, fat, juicy targets, but that you'd have a disaggregated architecture so that even if you lose some of your satellites, the degradation would be slow and graceful. You could still have capability. And there's been a new system proposed for launch detection satellites, which would reflect that. The problem is they don't seem to distinguish between conventional conflict and strategic conflict. And the problem with that is, if in 2018, the United States Nuclear Posture Review said that any attack on U.S. strategic command and control would be treated the same as an attack on our nuclear weapons, meeting with a nuclear response. But if you have these nuclear command and control involved in a purely conventional conflict, what happens if, say, the Chinese, to pick one example, would attack those satellites because they're providing information to purely conventional weapons? That's what they call nuclear entanglement, where your nuclear weapons and their missions get entangled with the mission of conventional weapons. There could be a serious problem where we would have would we strike back with nuclear weapons? It's hard to believe we would, but if we didn't, that might undercut the credibility of the U.S. Nuclear guarantee. So just to wrap up quickly, because I'm taking too much time already, we want to strengthen crisis stability, want to continue a U.S. emphasis on resilient, survivable, sustainable space assets, reduce entanglement. We want to deter conflict in space, not engage in it if it's entirely possible. We want to have dialogue with China, and we want to address space sustainability issues like debris and these mega constellations of huge numbers of satellites. We have more to lose in a space conflict than Russia or China. We want to take away the incentives for another country to attack by minimizing the vulnerability of our U.S. space assets. And future challenges are looming before us. There's almost a gold rush taking place to exploit economic and military opportunities of what they call, now here's a new one for you if you haven't heard of it, cislunar space. Cislunar space is the region in space between the Earth and the Moon and just a little bit beyond the Moon, in large volume, where there's already billions of dollars being talked about. Some research institutes in China talk about $1 trillion economy in cislunar space, if you can believe that. My inclination would be to laugh at that estimate, but of course I kind of laughed at the estimate that thought that there'd be billions and billions of dollars in the next few years in space, back from about 10 years ago. One final thought, and it'll leave you with, the reason for the explosion, important reason for the explosion of economic opportunity in space is that two key technology drivers, launch capability and the capability of the payloads, have declined in cost each by 95% over the last few years. Put the two together, and that means literally the cost of exploiting space has already declined by a factor of 400. If you can do things 400 times cheaper than you could some years ago, that's going to bring a lot of interest. And of course, the technological revolution isn't going to stop there, where it'll get even cheaper still. So with that, I will step aside and turn the table over to Brian Weeden, who is going to talk to us about sustainability of space and related issues. Brian, over to you, and thanks once again for your contribution to the book.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I'm actually up next. Brian and I called an audible on this.
And it didn't tell me. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. Hopefully you can. Oh, okay. My light just doesn't work. Okay, simple enough. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here. My apologies for not being Audrey Schaffer. If you're an Audrey Schaffer super fan and you're really and you want to take off at this point in a fit of disappointment, please go ahead. I will not be offended. So back in the before times, when Bruce asked me to contribute to this project, I was really pleased by the prospect of working on the problem of crisis stability in space, because up to that point, like some of the other folks on this panel, I've been involved in many discussions that sort of tended to resemble each other about space deterrence as a policy problem, which, at least at that time, and I think this is sometimes still true, tended to focus very narrowly on problems about how do we get the enemy not to attack our satellites in the event of a conflict, but tended to be focused very much on the space domain, sort of narrowly defined, with the capabilities of the satellites, the capabilities of the enemy, anti-satellite weapons, how dependent we were or how much we used the systems in question. And although those were interesting and important questions, it always struck me that they were not sort of looking at the full extent of the problem associated with crisis stability and the role of space in the outbreak of international conflict with sort of peer adversaries. And so that's what my tiny contribution to this volume is about, and that's what Bruce asked me to talk about here. So my sort of mini chapter in this is called 6 Propositions about Offense, Defense, and Crisis Stability in Space. I'm going to talk about some of them very briefly here. Bruce has already alluded to some of what's in it, so I'll try to be quick when I'm talking about the things that he has already sort of introduced. So the first one on the list is this space events of space don't happen in a vacuum pun, which I was pleased to see that Bruce likes. It seemed like a good idea at the time. I now have some colleagues who cringe whenever you have a punny title for a report, and so I'm of two minds about doing that, but I still do it. So the basic idea here is that you don't want to think about crisis stability in space in isolation from other things, right? Space systems, space capabilities matter because of their impact on terrestrial activities, terrestrial warfighting, or other terrestrial activities, right? The United States and China are not going to go to war probably because of space considerations, right? But space considerations may figure prominently into their decisions about whether to go to war and how to do it, right? The space systems are important because of the impact they have on air, land, and sea power, on control of territory, on the other things that matter to the states that are involved in a conflict. And space needs to be addressed that way, partly to understand what's going to happen with respect to these problems of space deterrence and stability, and also because of the impact that space can have on things beyond space in this sort of crisis stability context. So if you have a situation in which the strategic relationship between the United States and China is very stable, neither side perceives incentives to go to war with the other, right? It doesn't really matter how unstable the state situation is. It's not going to cause deterrence to break down and war to break out. Conversely, if either the United States or China decides it's a really good time to go to war against the other. There's compelling reasons to do this. The alternative is unattractive, and they think war is going to go well for them. Even if the space stability situation is really congenial and stable, it's not likely to prevent that from happening. And in the event that it does happen, the conflict probably will spread to space because usually, I mean, this is why wars tend to escalate, right? If any given increase in the intensity or the extent of a conflict is usually going to benefit one of the warring parties more than the other, and so they'll have some sort of incentive to escalate. Although you kind of still have situations in which both sides want to avoid the costs associated with it, and it doesn't happen. But this doesn't mean that stability in space doesn't matter, because you do have somewhere in between the situation where things are really stable and there's not going to be any war no matter what happens in space, and the situation where things are really, the deck's really stacked in favor of war, and it doesn't matter how safe space is, you're still going to end up with a conflict. You have this sort of zone in the middle of some indeterminate size in which space and perceived advantages to going to war there could have a significant impact on ultimately on the decision about whether the war happens or not, as well as if the war does happen, whether it spreads into space, right? Sort of a historical analogy might be Japan attacking Pearl Harbor, right? Japan didn't start the Pacific War in 1941 because they realized that Pearl Harbor was vulnerable and there's a great opportunity to strike this humiliating blow against the United States, but they had but the fact that they figured that out had a big impact on the decision to go to war when they already had other powerful incentives to do it, and on the way that they went about it. So the key question then comes down to whether when the state of space stability is going to tip the balance in favor of war or in favor of peace in a situation where it might go either way. Okay, second proposition is that when you're thinking about as with terrestrial stability, thinking about crisis stability, you got to think a lot about preemption and preventive war. So I'll spend a moment sort of disentangling these for anybody who's not already deeply immersed in them. Right? These are sort of the two ways that countries that don't really want to have a war with each other can still end up having one, other than just some accidental event kind of spinning out of control and leading to a conflict. Right? So preemption is fundamentally you start a war because for defensive reasons, because you think if you don't start the war, the other side is likely to start the war, and you think it's much better to be the country that strikes first rather than the country that strikes second. Right? It'll limit damage to yourself. It'll enable you to get the upper hand, and the war will turn out better if you get the first shot in, essentially. Right? Preventive war is closely related to that and often conflated with it, but it's different. Right? Preventive war, which actually happens not uncommonly in the international system, whereas real preemption is extremely rare, because preemption involves taking a situation where you don't want to fight a war and you decide to have one when perhaps there was still a chance to avoid it, so statesmen don't usually do it. Preventive war is basically saying, I don't really, other things being equal, I'd rather not have this war, but I think it's probably in the cards, and if I don't fight it now, I'm going to be fighting it later, and I'd rather fight it now because later is going to be worse for me, right? My allies will have abandoned me, technology will have shifted, my enemy will develop nuclear weapons, whatever it happens to be. And space stability figures in prominently to both of these dynamics, right? So we spend scenarios, for example, that on the preventive war side, right? What if Beijing decides that its power is plateauing, and it's time to make hay while the sun shines in terms of seizing Taiwan or achieving some other sort of national security objective that may be more easily accomplished in the near term than in the long term, as bad demographic trends kick in, or alliances shift, or your adversaries become better armed and stuff. Okay, third proposition, space power tends to be offense dominant at the tactical level. This is a fairly familiar point to anybody who deals with sort of space conflict issues. Satellites are relatively easy to see in space. They tend to move in predictable ways. Their ability to maneuver is limited, and amateur astronomers can track them. So even if you're not a superpower, you can get all sorts of information about where they're located. So if you have anti-satellite capabilities, you can use it against them. which means that you create, with space weapons, you create sort of use or lose situations if they're on orbit, right? If the enemy strikes first, they may destroy your space weapons before you get to use them. Even if your weapons aren't in orbit, there's still advantages, or likely to be advantages to striking first, because you can get your shots, your initial salvo of shots in before the enemy maneuvers their satellites out of the way or takes other sorts of measures to increase their survivability against an attack. And if they get the first shot in, then they'll have gained the advantage, right? This is an issue in sort of every domain of conflict, but because of the terrain of space and the nature of orbital mechanics, it tends to be particularly acute there. But it's important not to conflate sort of the offense-defense balance at different levels of war. Tactically, space is very offense-dominant, but at a more strategic level, it's more context-dependent. It's more contingent, right? And this is familiar from things like fighter aircraft at the tactical level can only sort of fight offensively. They don't really do anything defensive, but sort of operationally, they might be very effective as a defensive tool. Similarly with space weapons, right, with space capabilities tend to be good for the people, more useful to countries that are projecting power at long distances than countries that are fighting to defend their own homeland, for example. But if you're dealing with something like a Taiwan scenario where China is fighting close to home and the United States is fighting at long distance, it may be the defensive power is the one that is actually depending on being able to do the power projection. So the fact that they are more benefited by space capabilities, more dependent upon them, and potentially more vulnerable to attacks against them, is not necessarily a factor that is weighing in favor of sort of the defense rather than the offense at the strategic level. And then the final one that I've got on the list here is that it's important to recognize that the escalation relationship between conflict in space and other conflict, terrestrial conflict, is not really clear. Right, so Herman Kahn's famous ladder of escalation metaphor is terrible because it exaggerates how distinct escalation thresholds are and how much information people have and how controllable escalation is. And most important, you can't fall up a ladder. So I hate this, but well, let's stick with Herman for the moment and picture a ladder of escalation. Where's the space warfare rung on it, right? Lots of people think it's pretty obvious where it is, but they don't all agree on where that obvious place is. And I think the general tendency in my somewhat limited experience is that military space professionals tend to picture war in space is a really high extreme level on the ladder, right? You just extend the war to space, that's a huge step, right? It's very escalatory. And if that's the case, then space deterrence should be relatively easy to establish and maintain because people will be sort of scared of taking that giant leap into war in the heavens. But there's also a long tradition in military theory going back at least to the 1960s saying, well, actually war in space is a pretty mild form of war, right? Nobody directly gets hurt. The body count is likely to be low, even taking into account casualties that happen indirectly from space warfare. And so, therefore, it's not a big deal, right? Today we're thinking about things Putin might do to escalate in Ukraine. One of the possibilities might do some sort of ASAT attack against the West as a shot, sort of a low-cost shot across the bow. And if that's the case, then space stability is more fragile. Space deterrence is harder to maintain because the sort of stigma associated with it is just milder, and that means that space stability in a crisis is likely to be weaker, and then the real challenges may not be how do you keep terrestrial war from spreading into space, which in a major power conflict over high stakes is likely to be very hard to do, and instead you may want to think a lot more about how do you prevent a conflict in space from spreading to the Earth, because that's sort of the bigger escalatory step, and the thing that you may want to be preparing to stop. I think I'm out of time, and I will stop there and hand it over to Brian.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Bruce and SAIS for focusing on this issue and also inviting me to come. I want to focus my remarks sort of a couple areas. One, I want to start with why this is important, because I think we may lose track of that a little bit, and I just wanted to emphasize that point. we've seen now an emerging consensus, bipartisan consensus in the U.S. that China is going to be the major economic, foreign policy, national security challenge for the next few decades. People may have been surprised, may not have realized that a lot of the policies put in place by the Trump administration have been continued by the Biden administration when it comes to treating China as a serious competitive threat. And while I think we need to take that very seriously, we also need to figure out how to promote stability and avoid unwanted escalation. And that's not an admission of weakness, right? That has an importance. All the top military leaders have expressed publicly and repeatedly how disastrous a war between U.S. and China would be for everyone. And I think some of the American public have maybe lost a little bit of sight of that. We had 20 years of war between Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and a lot of that was kind of done over there. They didn't really see a lot of that. Maybe that has changed a little bit with Ukraine and sort of seeing just how devastating modern warfare can be for infrastructure, for civilians, for the people that are involved in the war. But if you even look just to see how disruptive what's happening in Ukraine has been for global trade, for markets, for economies, now imagine what it would be like for U.S. and China, right? Who are much bigger trading partners, much more involved in the global economy. It would be even more so. And then there's the nuclear aspect, right? Right now there's a lot of angst about whether or not Russia may or may not use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. A lot of concerns about that. If there is a future conflict, U.S. and China, that involves two nuclear superpowers. And again, the stakes there could not be higher. So, no matter how much we in America may dislike the Chinese Communist Party or disagree with their policies or feel like we need to prepare for war, I think we still need to be focused on avoiding unwanted, unnecessary war and avoiding escalation that could trigger it because the stakes are so high. And so when we get to space, a key issue we need to think about is that despite this significant competition we have with China, we are going to be operating in the same domain in space as they are. And that'll be that way for some time. And so just like we figured out ways to operate with the Soviets in global commons of sea and air during the Cold War and put in place ways to reduce chances of misperception, of mistakes that could increase or spark conflict, we need to figure out the same thing with China and space. We don't have to like it, but we have to figure out how to do it, just on a daily operational basis. And there's some other good examples for this. There's still a conflict going on in Syria that I think a lot of us have forgotten about. And in that, you have the U.S. and Russia are on opposite sides of this hot war. And yet, even though there is that going on, we still have regular interactions with the Russian military on deconflicting some of the air campaign so that what is happening in Syria doesn't trigger a broader conflict between the U.S. And Russia. The other point I want to make is that to avoid sort of just saying, well, this is all just Cold War redux, right? Cold War 2.0. There are, I think, some lessons to draw from that, and Karl talked about some of that when it comes to escalation, but I just want to say we need to avoid just outright copying strategies and thinking from the Cold War to what's going on now. One thing I just want to emphasize that I do think we should learn from is that strategic messaging is really hard and often doesn't work the way we think it might work. And it was mentioned in some of the experiences and some of the scenarios. I'm not a deep expert in that field, but the readings that I've done and the people I've talked to who are, my understanding is that we really didn't understand the Soviets as well as we thought we did. They definitely didn't understand us as much as they thought we did. There were signals we thought we were sending that weren't received or were misinterpreted. And if we could make it work in that sort of environment, where we actually did spend decades studying them, I think it's even harder to kind of do that and tailor that kind of strategic messaging and get all the nuances right to manage the escalation ladder and all that kind of stuff. It's even harder in the current times. The other reason that we're not in Cold War 2.0 is just not just the US and China. We're not in a bilateral competition, but a multipolar competition, a multipolar world. Russia is still around, if people haven't forgotten about that. They're still a nuclear power. They still have significant space capabilities, and we're seeing some of their willingness to use those playing out in Ukraine. There are other emerging space powers on the global scene. There are regional relationships. There's more than just the US and China. So we can't just think about, let's copy that bilateral situation of the Cold War and move it over to currently today. And to pick up another theme that Bruce mentioned, it's not just governments, it's commercial industry. As you mentioned, the vast majority of satellites right now are owned by companies in space. Over half are owned by one guy and one company. And that's going to continue to grow over the next several decades as the commercial industry continues to invest and move into space. And so we now not only have the role of how do we do stability and escalation management and avoiding misperceptions and risks between two nuclear-armed superpowers, but how we do it between multiple nuclear powers, multiple countries that are operating in space, and all the commercial stuff flying around in space. What are the odds of a commercial collision happening, and what if a commercial satellite happens to collide with a national security satellite? What are the implications from that for something playing out, especially if it happens in a matter of heightened tension? What about the role of commercial companies involved in warfare? Again, we are seeing that right now playing out in Ukraine with the role that Starlink is playing in supporting the Ukrainian military, the role that commercial satellite imagery companies, Maxar, Planet, many others are playing in supporting those operations. How does that affect some of these dynamics? Huge challenges. And finally, I'll just say that there's a concern here beyond just the concern of conflict and war, and that is the broader impact it has on the long-term sustainable use of space. We in the United States, every country in the world, the human civilization is increasingly reliant on space for everything from communications to transportation, to sensing our world, to science, to pretty much everything. And there's a lot of bad things that could happen that are going to have serious negative, long-term negative impacts. We saw in November 2021, Russia tested an anti-satellite weapon that created a couple thousand pieces of orbital debris that is still hanging around. It's still a problem. Just yesterday, NASA had to move the International Space Station to avoid a close approach and possible collision with a piece of that debris. Now imagine if we decided to blow up, or didn't decide it, but someone decided to blow up a couple of dozen satellites or more. That is going to be a problem even long after any conflict ends, and may have huge impacts for everyone not involved in the conflict. And that's on top of all the challenges, the day in and day out congestion with all these satellites, and avoiding collisions and the constellations and the radio frequency spectrum interference and everything else we haven't really talked about today. So I will end there. Just wanted to emphasize why this is an important issue, and some points to think about where it's not just Cold War redux, and why it has implications beyond just a conflict itself.
Okay, well, Brian, thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Kari Bingen, last but certainly not least, to give her perspectives on the issue of crisis stability in space.
Well, and I very much enjoyed all the comments in your description of the report. So I do want to thank SAIS and congratulate you on the Space Force announcement. I mean, that kind of education and really development and cross-pollination between the uniform as well as the civilians that they'll be immersed with here, I think is incredibly beneficial. So congratulations. I also want to congratulate Bruce and the authors on this excellent report. And I do recommend its reading to policymakers, operators, and technologists. I do think it's timely. It's a thoughtful examination of an area that is not well understood, and I think it's useful for identifying areas for further scholarship and analysis. I really liked Brian's comments here. You know, I tend to think, you know, we can have thoughtful discussions in this area that are not dissimilar to the issues that they wrestled with in space decades ago, at sea. The physics are a little bit different here. You've got the wicked thing called gravity, so things stay in orbit a lot longer, but the community has had to wrestle with similar types of issues, so it is not unobtainium from my perspective. You know, I want to start by saying, or emphasizing that space remains an advantage for us, and its role in modern warfare has evolved since the Cold War, where you could argue it played a largely stabilizing role. The U.S. way of warfighting, how our military fights, how it projects power, is dependent on space. It is dependent on space. Just if you think about the last 20 years in counterterrorism alone, navigation, movement of forces, communications, precision weapons, ISR, unmanned aerial vehicle operations, from the communications links to the command and control, weather, battle damage assessment, all of these different functions and activities relied on space, and that will be even greater going into the future. And I do worry that there is a lack of appreciation among folks outside of space circles on just how critical and integral it is to our daily lives, not just in warfighting, but more broadly. And really, there's an assumption there, and you see it in some of the war games that many of us play, there's an assumption that space will be there. And they don't quite know how to comprehend when it starts getting degraded or it's not there. Second thought here is just on the threat, and I very much enjoyed or appreciated, I'll say not enjoyed, but appreciated the opening passage on how much has changed since the last report. Again, a mere 6 years. Bruce mentioned this, our adversaries, they understand our dependence on space. They've gone to school on us. They are developing asymmetric ways to erode our advantage. Space is right now an attractive target. It is not surprising that the Russians targeted space early in the Ukrainian conflict. Viasat, Starlink, GPS, because of that vital role that they play in communications, command and control, ISR targeting. I thought it was significant in the 2020 Department of Defense China report that they said, quote, China seeks to create disruptive and destructive effects to shape decision-making and disrupt military operations in the initial stages of a conflict by targeting and exploiting perceived weaknesses of militarily superior adversaries, end quote. So again, there's incentive there for them to go to target early in a conflict. You pair that with that intent, if you will, with capability. Both China and Russia are developing a full spectrum of weapons to degrade and destroy space capabilities. And so that's talked about in here, from cyber and non-kinetic and reversible like jamming to more kinetic and destructive. Brian mentioned the Russian ASAT test. There's also been activity out at geo orbit, so Chinese SJ-27 satellite, close approach, maneuvering around an inactive Chinese GPS-like satellite, latching onto it and moving it into another orbit. That demonstrates a counter space weapons capability. You look at what Russia is doing. It was reported earlier in the year that they launched a satellite into the same orbit as a U.S. government or NRO satellite. Previously, they launched an inspector satellite moving near a U.S. government satellite. They've also demonstrated a nesting doll capability with these high-speed projectiles that can be ejected out. The other thing I'd say on the threat, and I've started watching this early in the 2000s and now seeing it. You know, it started out with those one-off R&D or one-off demonstrations. The 2007 China ASAT test is an example of that. But what we're seeing now is so much more comprehensive and at a scale. They're fielding. What do you do once you've developed something in R&D? You produce it, you deploy it, you organize around it, and you train. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So this is significant. And there's a real risk here of these intended and unintended effects that are described in the report. The commercialization piece, and I'm glad that was raised. The accessibility and scale of the activity in the private sector and internationally is pretty phenomenal. The future is going to be overwhelmingly commercial and globalized and no longer dominated by a few governments and government dollars. We are seeing the commercialization of areas that were long done by governments and classified. So imagery, the radio frequency signals, space situational awareness, on-orbit servicing, these proliferated architectures. It is quite phenomenal to have come from a community where you launch $1 billion satellite every 5-10 years to now going to certain commercial production houses and seeing them pump out 6 satellites a day off their production line, a day. I mean, it's phenomenal. You look at that and then the convergence of those space capabilities with what's being done with big data analytics and processing, artificial intelligence, quite an opportunity here for us to leverage, but also recognize our adversaries and others can leverage this as well. There are over 100 countries with satellites in space, and building off of Bruce's figure, over 1,000 satellites alone were put into orbit in the first 6 months of 2022. So this adds an additional layer of complexity and challenge for the government and policymakers. What is the incentive to target commercial? What is the role of government in protection? The debris generation of all of these assets, the space traffic management as was discussed, and then how do you distinguish between commercial activity and a threat activity that is of hostile intent? We've long looked at space as this pristine environment. You could build those big, exquisite satellites with little to no protection other than against the space environment like radiation. Now, as General Hyten has referred to them, they're just now big, fat, juicy targets. We need to think about space the way we do other domains. At sea, would we send a carrier out alone? No, you send it as part of a package of things. Maybe you send in jammers before the fire aircraft. You send a carrier battle group to protect the carrier at sea. Our thinking in space, where we have these exquisite one-offs out there, that must evolve as well. I did very much appreciate Karl's point and made in the report is that there is no space war, only war. Future conflicts, they will be multi-domain, and you can't think of space in isolation. So we need to think about the escalation ops and escalation management, not just space for space's sake, but looking at space with other domains and other functional areas. But we've done this before. We've thought through nuclear and conventional escalation in other domains like air and sea. A couple of thoughts here lastly on the recommendations. I very much appreciated the emphasis on resilience. It is a form of deterrence by denial, showing an adversary that they cannot defeat the capabilities provided by our space systems, or at least creating uncertainty that they can achieve their desired effect. That resiliency, it's not just through proliferated and distributed constellations, but also think about the multiple pathways to be able to get information to users. You can't take down a single link. I think this can also manifest itself through the greater use and integration of commercial and allied and partner space capabilities that we should emphasize a bit further. On offense, protection of space has both defensive and offensive components. And I go back to thinking about the purpose of a capability. So, you play defense to protect your assets, your use of space, the effects that they can generate, on the ground below. So why would you go offensive? Think about your adversary in a crisis or conflict, how they're using space. Do we want our adversary to be able to track carriers, our land forces with impunity? So how do we hold those space capabilities at risk? And how do we have that? How do we have that policy? How do we have that reveal, conceal conversation? I think there's a lot of there's some important, significant questions here to be addressed. And again, how do we figure out how to have a more open conversation on this? Norms. How do I put this in? I try to think about, so what we all throw out this term norms of behavior, but what does it mean? I actually look at it more in terms of, I'll say commercial, is when you think about some of these phenomenal on-orbit servicing capabilities that are coming online, if you have a commercial capability that can that's out at geostationary orbit, it's maneuvering, it approaches a disabled satellite, it latches onto that satellite, services it, moves it, etc. what's the difference between that commercial services behavior on orbit and bad guy? We need to be able to work government, like-minded international partners, the commercial sector, in figuring out what right looks like so you can identify what bad or hostile looks like. And to me, that's why norms are so significant. I also really like the discussion on gaming because I've seen space white-carded in so many war games. We do need to think through that escalation management in space and also that interplay with those other domains. A strike in space doesn't necessarily mean retaliation in space. And this is where I believe space is different than nukes, and we need to be careful on that. Think through those multiple moves, those responses, those off-ramps, both in space and then in other areas, cross-domain and cross-functionally. And testing those theories, thinking about credibility of your options, the signaling and messaging, risk of miscalculation, those are all incredibly important factors to address. Two additions that I'd like to mention, and I will admit I only skimmed the report, but intelligence is going to be so critical here. Intelligence and attribution, and particularly to help manage in crisis management and escalation management, the further left of the crisis that you can get in understanding what's happening, the more decision space and options that you will provide your senior leadership. So intelligence is incredibly important. Plus just ensuring that you are developing those capabilities that can protect and then or potentially defeat your adversary. The other additional point I would just make is in all of this, there is an urgency here that sometimes gets missed. I mean, we just had the CCP Congress with President Xi last week announcing that by 2027 they are building their military into a world-class force. Space acquisition takes a long time, and we're hopefully doing better at that. But we really do need to think through the tools in the toolkit are what we have, and we need to think through how do you integrate them, how do you make sure they're effective, all of these policy issues that are no doubt right at our front doorstep. There's an urgency here. The last point I'd make is maybe more of a caution and an open question is I don't know how far to take this nuclear analogy and the framework. I think there are some similarities, but there are differences. There needs to be this more, I'll say, normalized discussion about space, not just from a strategic first strike, second strike perspective, but also, it is part of modern warfare. Just like we can have discussions in the air domain, bombers, or in the sea domain, SSBNs versus commerce versus science, we need to be able to think through those differences in the space domain as well. So I'll stop there.
Okay, well, Kari, thank you very much for that illuminated discussion. We now, with the permission of the audience, we will turn to take questions and hopefully provide some kind of answers. No
promises.
Anybody have a question for any of us? I see a hand there.
John Gaylor. I'm in the DIA program right now. I'm also a former space operator in the Air Force.
And for people with DIA, you're not referring to the Defense...
Doctor in International Affairs program.
Not the Defense Intelligence Agency, just so you know. Okay, good.
I really thank you guys for the topic. As a space professional, it's great to see this kind of material coming through the program. As I've got to see Nate go through it, and being a space professional myself. One of the things I picked up on was your sorcerer's apprentice analogy, and getting back to Kari's last comments there about intelligence. As SAIS is now positioning itself to be the lead, you're going to be developing the future senior guardians of this nation, and we have a new service. I'd be interested in thoughts from any of the panelists on potentially what that future guardian would look like. If we talk about a sorcerer's apprentice, that there's not really a senior leader that has had experience in space, and in fact, most of ours came from a missileer construct. Most of them came from an operations construct where the operators...
Our missileer right here.
Where the operators of the space domain were molded to be looking like fighter pilots so they could compete. With an opportunity to stand up a new service, how does that look? What kind of skills would you project that the future guardian should have? Should it be more intelligence focused? Should it be more R&D and engineering focused? Because so we look at commercial industry, a lot of the actual application and space operations are done primarily by automation of computers, and the really hard tasks given out in the United States Space Force are done by contractors. So I'd be interested in what you think the future of a Guardian should look like and how that will move through, especially as SAIS can play such a heavy role in the future of the Space Force. Thank you.
Sure. I'll just throw a couple comments in and then turn it over to my fellow panelists. To me, an important consideration in all my dealings with bureaucracy that it is too easy to think of diplomacy and foreign policy as, oh, that's the soft stuff, that to think of just military solutions. One of the things that I mentioned Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan is the idea of to me, military force and military policy and diplomacy are a terrific combination together when they work together in a coordinated way. I think one of the wonderful things about, and I salute the Space Force for doing what they're doing, is to be open to what diplomacy has to teach, not as in opposition to what military capabilities are, but rather working together so that you can get synergistic effects. So, and then again, I'm proud that they were able to bring this off, and I think the affiliation with APL, the Applied Physics Lab, certainly doesn't hurt, and they show a lot of sophistication in that area, and I'm just excited at the opportunities, and with that, I'll turn it over to our resident missileer here for.
So I think this is one of the hardest challenges the Space Force has, because they have to approach this very differently than the other services have. They're honestly, how fast you can run and how far you can run and how much you can lift doesn't matter for a Space Force Guardian. Now, there's certainly, you got to be healthy, right? There's sort of a health component to that. But that doesn't matter for how you do your job, because your job is mostly going to be sitting in front of a computer, and it's much more about your ability to think abstractly about what's going on, right? Because what's happening in space is completely different from how things move in air, on the surface of the water. Thinking all mechanics. It's almost more like a subdriver sort of a perspective than what we think of the other forces. So that's one big part of it. They got to be technology natives, because this is all math and computers and software and radio frequency signals, and just have to be comfortable with all of that, right? And then also being able to think on your feet. And this is I think one of the hardest challenges the Space Force has in front of them, because they're having to, I suspect, going to have to deviate significantly from the traditional military recruiting model of how they do the candidate system, and once they bring people in, then the traditional sort of way you grow someone or develop them over their career is going to be totally different. We're not talking about 1 million people or even 100,000 people in the Space Force, right? It's going to be very small, because it's mostly about the robots, the satellites, and how you use those capabilities. So even the same force structure is totally different. So I've been heartened a little bit by some of the announcements coming out of the Space Force, and these Raymond's been saying about the way they're approaching this. I think they're on sort of the right track. Still have a ways to go. It's going to be really difficult.
Yeah, if I can add, so the great thing is now you're buying 8 years back, that you don't have to be a missileer and start out there. But by the time I see somebody up at, say, the general officer ranks, I would love to see them have a multidisciplinary background, so that they've had time in the acquisition world, in the operational world, in the policy world, in the international world, sort of had an international assignment, to have gone out to the private sector. I'll tell you, after having been in government so long, it was an education for me going out into the private sector and learning what they can do and really what motivates and drives them. I really like the announcement that SAIS just made. If I think about professional military education, so many of these jobs, they're just focused day to day. They don't have the bandwidth to really sit back and think. That's just so it's unbelievable, but it's true. So to take that year in your PME, your professional military education, to go to school, to be a military fellow at a think tank or another organization, as you're rising, you've had enough basic experience and knowledge to now think strategically about those issues that you're going to have to wrestle with at then the senior officer levels as you interact with Congress, with the White House, with allies and partners. That is incredibly important. Then the last thing I'd say is just Space Force needs to be very cautious on not insulating and just talking to space folks. So making sure that you are cross-pollinizing, getting out to the geographic commands, the international piece I mentioned, so you can see how those space capabilities and those effects are impacting other domains and other mission areas.
Okay, yeah, in the back there.
Thank you very much for an illuminating presentation and discussion. My name is Neil Wolf. I'm an attorney, not currently practicing in defense or foreign policy or space, but continuing work on the LLM degree at McGill's Institute of Air and Space Law, where I'm not enrolled. Instead, I'm enrolled at the Maxwell CSIS Executive Masters in IR. As I'm sure Dr. Weeden knows, because I believe you've worked on both of the projects, there are 2 international law reference manual projects underway, one at McGill and one at, I believe, Woomera in Australia. Both of them are designed to codify, if you will, the state of the law, international humanitarian law, the law of war, with regard to space activities. At least the McGill manual, at last report, was taking input as to its formulation of the rules of the road, if you will. What do you think of those efforts? Do you think they contribute to the positive development of norms which Kari mentioned? Do you think that they're too academic and too idealistic? Do you think they'll help? Thanks.
I'll start just because I've been involved in both of them, and I'll give a little bit of background there. So yes, they're meant to kind of give an overview of the current state of international law when it comes to both peacetime space activities, what might constitute threshold of use of force, armed attack, and then conduct of military activities in an actual armed conflict involving space. And there's similar other things. There's sort of the San Remo manual on maritime warfare. There's the Tallinn manual on cyber warfare. They're meant to be in those categories. I'll say I think the biggest value of them is going to be in exposing the holes and the gaps. I served as a technical advisor to both of the projects, and in many, many cases where it came to how does this aspect of law of armed conflict apply to conflict in space or military satellites, the answer is we don't know. There's no state practice. There's no precedent. There's no opinio juris. There's really nothing, and so I think that's going to be the biggest takeaway from those. And back to kind of what we talked about this earlier about sort of the escalation and there's a huge open discussion about does an attack on a satellite constitute a use of force? Well, okay, what if it's just jamming? Or what if it's versus a destruction? What if it's one satellite versus 5 out of a constellation, right? And does the type of satellite matter? And which of those might be considered an armed attack, which then opens up the UN Charter and legal response? We don't know. And I'll say that the Woomera manual, they did a period of state engagement organized by the Netherlands over the summer, and they sent copies to every UN member country, and they got responses back from several dozen, as far as I understand it, and they're still working through that, and they're all over the place. So, there's no consensus among the countries on how to interpret any of this. So, anyways, I think the biggest use of those manuals is going to be to identify the gaps and the things we have to work on. I don't think they're going to say we could provide all the answers.
Okay, here, Nate.
Thank you. One might argue that over the past 60 years, from an organizational perspective, that we have some work ahead of us to overcome constraints that have developed over time around, and this is kind of picking up on the last question too, around authorities, regulations, policy, and obligations. Is it time for the U.S. to consider a Department of Space or a organization that is a hybrid that ameliorates problems of fragmentation around these kinds of things? For example, communications, launch, aerospace, and so on. Would that create some stability? Would that have an effect on stability, here at home as well as, internationally? I guess that's what I'm getting at.
I mean, there is this thing called the National Space Council. No, I say that cheeky.
And this kind of leads up to November 21st, the listening session that's coming up on authorities for the National Space Council. Well,
yeah, there's kind of two different threads that I might pull on in your comments and your questions. So one is, each of the different agencies in government do have a different lens through which they look at things. NASA, civilian, space, transportation, launch, Office of Commerce, NOAA, and obviously defense, from a more defense, obviously protection, military perspective, state diplomacy. So I'm not sure a Uber Department of Space cutting across all those agencies makes sense. I mean, heck, let's get Space Force and Space Command nurtured and really off the ground. No pun intended. But that's what the White House, the NSC, the National Space Council, that's their job, is to bring the interagency together to discuss and deliberate on common issues. And I hope that not everyone's going into those deliberations with a kind of yes sir, yes man attitude. Is you want them to come in with different perspectives. You want them to really fight for their perspective or their position, and then to have those senior policymakers at the White House, the president, then making decisions based on the best information available. The other thing I'll comment on is just international is with the proliferation and accessibility of space technology. We talked about how many more actors there are in space. Governments, international entities, private corporations, not just in the US, but abroad. Yes, we need to protect our most sensitive technology. However, there is so much opportunity in space for us to work with our allies and partners, and we still have a very antiquated way in which we approach our export policies on what we can and can't do with our close allies and partners, particularly in the commercial space sector. And I think there's a need to relook at that. And so I do appreciate in the National Space Council wanting to take that on.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Michael Mara. I'm a reporter with Inside Defense. I had a question about offensive weapons in space. So DoD has been pretty tight-lipped about this concept. And if this is in the report, please accept my mea culpa in advance. I haven't had time to read the full thing yet. But I wanted to ask, what does effective, responsible offensive weapons in space look like? And would that be limited to non-kinetic means? Is it possible to have a kinetic offensive space capability that's also responsible and won't create collateral effects like more debris that we have to worry about?
Let me take a stab at that and then ask my fellow panelists to give you a perspective as well. One thing I would say, first of all, I have no knowledge of inner deep workings, but or what may be underway or not, but it strikes me that it would be foolhardy and dangerous to rely upon kinetic a kinetic offensive weapon. I think a thought exercise I like to suggest to people is that imagine if at least half the bullets fired in World War II were still whizzing around Europe. You'd probably be spending fewer vacations in Germany or France than you otherwise might. The problem is, what is it? The James Bond movie Diamonds Are Forever. Debris in space is potentially forever, and it's can be very difficult to deal with. So whatever we would do, to my mind, would need to be non-kinetic, or unless someone can come. I mean, I'm open to any argument, but that it's a problem. That's why I mentioned it in my remarks about how do you deter if you don't let people know. I mean, we know in the nuclear picture we have a very clear idea of what we have, and at some point I think we're going to need to address this question. I would add the one additional proviso is that whatever you do to come out of the closet on offense, there needs to be a diplomatic adjunct on it. You know, Jimmy Carter in the intermediate range nuclear forces thing, thank goodness he included arms control as one component of the going forward with the Pershing II and the ground launch cruise missile. So that, once again, the idea of the partnership between a good, strong military posture and a good, strong diplomatic posture, you can't go too far wrong with that. But it's kudos to you for identifying an issue that needs to be addressed. Let me turn to my fellow panelists here, who might have something to say about it.
I guess I'll add a couple of things, and I love the what if the bullets were still whizzing around Europe analogy. I'm gonna steal and use that frequently, I think.
Feel free to borrow it, to use it at will.
This is in terms of sort of the theory and doctrine of this is really complicated, right? Because in offense and defense mean something different in space than they do in the other domains, right? All the other domains, with the possible exception of cyber, which we pretend doesn't exist because it's really complicated, right? It's defined geographically, right? You're defending your territory, you're taking somebody else's territory or something, right? Because of orbital mechanics, space doesn't work that way, so defending your territory from somebody else's satellite is an offensive action. Protecting your satellite while it's spying on or facilitating attacks on the enemy is a defensive action. Is defensive in terms of space doctrine. And so this leads to, I think, a lot of confusion, right? And I think Bruce is right that you want to, when you're promulgating your policy, you want to say, you know, what I envision using space weapons, or which are of course also hard to define sometimes. What you're going to use them for. The debris generation thing is obviously a big issue, and not to be pedantic, not quite the same as kinetic, right? Because if you're grappling the enemy satellite and wrestling it to the ground or something, right, that's a kinetic action, but it's not generating debris. And there's non-kinetic things you can do actually that do generate debris potentially in terms of attacking satellites. My expectation, without knowing anything about exactly what's in the development pipeline, is that we're probably looking hard for elegant solutions to any satellite capabilities that aren't debris generating. I do wonder if a lot of sort of practitioners on the U.S. side project more squeamishness on potential adversaries about generating debris than that would actually be the case. I mean, there's been a lot of war games where, you know, the Russians or the Chinese use a weapon that generates a lot of debris, and a lot of the American players think, oh, now the whole world is going to rise up and realize what villains they are and stuff, and they don't care. You know, they're fighting for their national survival or something, and you know, generating space debris and then Kessler syndrome threats is just something that doesn't loom as large in the red player's imagination as you might wish.
And yet, Russia hasn't attacked any of the Starlink satellites, you know? And to me, so I think, and China hasn't repeated its ASAT test in 2007. I think for me, the question starts with why are we doing it, right? What is the point of those capabilities? This is not a new question. There's actually some excellent research out there on this exact same debate was held at the end of the Ford administration, early Carter administration, so 75, 76, on what should the U.S. develop an offensive and a satellite capability, and if so, why? And the decision they made was that, the conclusion they came to was, we should, but not for deterrence, because it's not going to have a deterrent impact. We need to have one for what Kari said, which is to use against the Soviet space capabilities during an armed conflict. And at that time, it was the Rorsats and EOSats that would be used to track and target carrier battle groups for air-launched cruise missile attacks. And if you ever read Red Storm Rising by Clancy, this is exactly what the scenario that plays out in that book. So the F-15 ASAT program that was actually greenlit by the Carter administration was the outcome of that decision. And that was not there to deter Soviet attacks on US satellites. It was there to take out specific Soviet satellites in the event of an armed conflict to basically help protect US carriers. So first make that decision, why are we having them? My suspicion is that the era of destructive ASAT weapons is probably coming to an end. And I say that because you avoid them by building distributed constellations, right? They're only really useful if you've got 3 or 4 satellites you can't replace. If you've got a dozen or several dozen or hundreds or thousands of satellites, destroying 1 or 2 of them is not going to have that big of a deal, right? There, your offensive choices are more of cyber attacks, electronic warfare, that sort of thing. And if you look at what China is building, right, they're not building 1, 2, or 3, sitting ducks that can't be defended, right? They're building constellations of dozens to hundreds of satellites. So to me, that suggests that probably that's not the way the U.S. should go, even if we weren't worried about the debris problem. And I'll just close by saying, the Department of Defense is supportive of the ASAT moratorium announced by the Vice President earlier this year, because when you talk to the DoD, they're like, yeah, we have other ways to do that. We don't need to resort to those destructive weapons. We have other ways to take care of the problem. And oh, by the way, the U.S. Department of Defense is still the biggest user of space, so if we were to use those, we're the ones probably going to have to deal with the most with all that debris up there.
Right. Kari, do you have anything to add?
I will look forward to the next question.
Okay, I'll just add one additional thought, is that I would keep my eye on the developments that are going on for ground-based conflict of using high-energy lasers on armored or something like that. It's in the open literature that there have been high-energy lasers tested at like 70,000, 70 kilowatts or something like that. And whatever we can do on the ground, I'm wondering what could potentially be done up in space. That's based just on nothing more than reading Aviation Week. So I'll confess to that. Daniel, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
I did. It was partly answered just now, the distributed systems. But I was struck by the frequent mention of resiliency. And being a novice in this area, my question was, what are you talking about? What are the main sort of technological solutions to resiliency?
If I just throw in one thing, there used to be an old TV ad for Timex watches. Do you remember, takes a licking and keeps on ticking?
Yeah, and this distributed systems thing is partly that.
Partly.
And I heard an answer about having
Okay.
fleets of satellites that protect each other.
So-
But I wondered if somebody could go over
Sure.
what.
Really quickly, and I know Kari knows this as well. I'll just say this has been a focus of U.S. national security space policies for the last decade, dating back to the 2011 national security space strategy. There's actually a really good document out there that I'll point to. It's called a Taxonomy for Space Mission Assurance that was put out 2015 or 16, something like that, when Doug Lavero was Office Secretary of Defense. And it lays out sort of the different categories of techniques. There's just dispersion, there's deception, there's disaggregation, and it sort of defines what those are and kind of how they might play together. And the main takeaway, I would say, is how you mix those together to create a resilient solution depends upon the capability. So the way you do that for missile warning might look different than for SATCOM or for GPS. But I know Kari's also worked on this.
No, I would just pick up right after that. I mean, it is simple. It is as simple as, if you take an attack, you can still do your job. You can still do the mission. But let me be careful to say it doesn't necessarily have to be in that domain. Well, so space, I mean, mission assurance in space, if a couple of your GPS satellites are taken out, you still have sufficient number of GPS satellites or sufficient number of communication satellites to still do the job, which is that GPS signal or to be able to provide communications links to those folks on the ground or in the aircraft. But you also don't have to think about that mission assurance just being provided by space alone. So is there an airborne solution to GPS that doesn't require satellites, that can still get that user on the ground with that navigation information? So when you think of resilience, I like that Timex analogy. It's you take a licking, but you keep on ticking. You can do the job. Yeah. And the hard part with space, though, is back to this whole discussion on it being pristine and these mega giant school bus sized Battlestar Galacticas, is it's really hard to absorb an attack if you're an architecture of 4 satellites and you've spent multi-billions of dollars on each one of those satellites. It's a lot easier to absorb an attack and keep going if you have thousands of them and you've taken out a couple of nodes.
My goodness, what a fabulous, fabulous discussion that was. I think everyone appreciates how complicated this subject is, how multiple layered it is, how complicated the practical solutions are to this complex world challenge. I mean, we've been really very grateful to you, Bruce, for all of your work. It's just amazing. And also to our experts panelists, Brian Weeden, Karl Mueller, and Kari Bingen, for providing such really good insights and succinctly summarizing insights into this, as I said, completely complicated topic. You have been an incredibly engaged audience. I would like to thank you as well for sticking with us for this discussion, for raising your important questions, and by therefore providing the kind of insights that we need moving forward with practical solutions to this real world problem. And it's not going to be easy, but we've got some great insights that have been provided by our experts and our panelists. And I would like to ask you to join me in thanking them for their presentations and for their expertise. And I thank you, our audience, for joining us today.